Great. Good evening, and thank you for being here for this evening's, we called it a fireside chat, but I really think that waterside chat is much more appropriate in this venue. So today's talk we're calling Global Hotspots and America's Role in the World. I can't think of anything more interesting in today's environment to have this talk. My name is Stephanie McCormick, and I'm a portfolio manager at Brown Advisory. I work with families and foundations. One of the things that I most appreciate about our firm is the fact that we really emphasize education and learning from each other and also from our network. This evening's gathering is a great example of our learning from our network. We're really privileged to host and have the chance to learn from Jake Sullivan. Jake, now this is going to take me a while to go through because he's got a pretty impressive resume. Jake is currently the Martin R. Flug Lecturer in Law at Yale Law School and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Jake helped lead the secret diplomacy that paved the way for the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Following his service in government, he was the senior policy advisor on Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. It's a mouthful, and we thank you for your service. Today, Jake also serves as co-chair of the National Security Action, a leading national security advocacy organization. So he's a busy guy. Moderating our fireside chat will be my fellow portfolio manager and partner, Mitchell Whiteman. Before entering the investment business more than a decade ago, Mitchell was a financial journalist. You might be able to find some of his early interviews on YouTube. He is well suited for this role this evening, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. It's my pleasure to introduce Jake and Mitchell.
Jake, thanks for being here. There's no lack of craziness in the world. We could talk about any one of a number of foreign countries or yearbooks and where to start. I think the overlay to what we're going to talk about today there's some themes, and in the post-World War II era, there was a certain order to the world that the U.S. was not only instrumental, but really led in creating the world that we know today and hopefully know tomorrow. There are situations going on with Russia and North Korea, Iran, China, the EU, that makes all of this slightly more precarious than it was yesterday. So if we start with, let's say, Russia, because Russia's been in the news a little bit in the past couple of years, the aggressiveness that we started to see with the Ukraine and Crimea that fast-forwarded to where we are today, is there any abatement that you could see happening? Will that just continue to persist as long as Putin is where he is and the dynamics continue to exist there?
I think this is going to accelerate and not abate. If you take a step back and put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes, he's basically going to bed at night worried primarily about one thing, which is how does he maintain his grip on power in Russia? And how does he do so in a context where a few years ago, Russia's economy was the same size as Italy. Now it's between South Korea and Australia and declining fast, and where the life expectancy of Russian men is going down by a year every couple years. It's now in the mid-60s and also declining fast. So Russia's population's declining, its economy is deteriorating, and so Putin doesn't have a bargain with his citizens other than an argument rooted in national prestige. Russia matters on the world stage. And how does it matter? Well, primarily, the way that he is advancing Russia's sort of capacity to be a significant actor is by trying to disrupt and destabilize the West, to undermine democratic systems across Europe and the United States, and to essentially be able to say to his people, you don't want any part of that. Those systems, those are a mess. And by the way, the ascendant forces in those countries share my values, my Vladimir Putin's values, a kind of neo-fascist, identitarian, anti-LGBT, traditional values kind of thing, which you can see from right-wing parties in Germany and France and Sweden, and certain political forces here in the United States.
Is that, when you think of that sweep of the strong man, of totalitarian values, how does that feed into what you're seeing in the EU today, kind of working its way up into Brexit?
So there's a direct line, even more direct than what we saw in the Russian interference in the American election, between Russian money and major political parties, individuals, and forces across Europe. Russian money and support for Brexit, because pulling one of the major pillars of the European Union out of the European Union serves Putin's long-term interests. Russian money for various political parties in Italy, who are now talking about having Italy follow suit if Brexit kind of works out for the UK. Maybe Italy will be next. Russian money for the National Front in France, for a party called the AfD in Germany, all of whom share in common a kind of general skepticism of liberal, pluralistic democracy, and I mean that liberal in the kind of small L sense, and who share in common a dislike for the EU. Which, if you go back to Ukraine, the start of your question, what was it that got Putin into Crimea in the first place? It was the notion that Ukraine was going to join the European Union, which Putin could not accept. And so, from his perspective, rather than just constantly playing defense against what he sees as the encroachment of these democracies towards his border, why not play a little offense? Why not go out there and undermine and weaken these other countries? It was Woodrow Wilson who said that the object of American foreign policy is to make the world safe for democracy. In a way, what Putin wants to do is make the world safe for authoritarianism. And he's actively promoting a foreign policy to do that. And the interesting thing is he's got an American president who, whatever you think about Donald Trump's relationship with Russia as it goes to the 2016 election, who looks at Russia and basically says, why wouldn't we get along with this country? He said this all the time during the campaign. Why don't we get along? And I think that view has actually honestly come by for Trump. It's wrong, but it's honestly come by, because Trump basically sees two bad actors in foreign policy: allies who take advantage of us, which Russia is not, and trading partners who've screwed us over, and we don't trade with Russia beyond a nominal amount. Therefore, why wouldn't we get along with this country of white Christian people who don't like the bad Muslim terrorists, this country that could potentially be a friend of ours to go against the Chinese, who are a real long-term threat? So in Trump's mind, in a way, and by the way, Trump is probably as averse to some of these core liberal pluralistic values as Putin is. So, he's got an affinity for these strong men, and he hates the European Union with almost as great a passion as Putin does. So you have a funny coincidence right now of an American president and a Russian president embarked on a very similar project: undermine the European Union.
So as we go slightly south from Europe, but stay with Russia, Russia goes into and becomes very relevant in Syria, which helps further embolden Iran. Can you talk about Russia moving into Syria, and then we'll move into Iran next?
So the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the Cold War clashed across the Middle East for influence. And over time, towards the end of the Soviet Union, the US had come to really dominate in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and other places. The one place that the Soviet Union and then Russia held on to was Syria. They've had a base on the Mediterranean in Syria going all the way back to the Cold War. They've had a longstanding relationship with Assad. The Russian Orthodox Church has deep ties to the Orthodox community in Syria. And so they have a stake, an invested stake in keeping this regime in power. That plus the fact that, especially after Libya, Putin has made it his mission to stop the United States from being able to succeed in any further regime change in the Middle East, meant that he was going to do whatever he could to keep Assad in Damascus in the presidential palace. But whatever he could, from his perspective, did not mean putting Russian troops on the ground. So Russia could supply the Air Force for Assad, But somebody had to come in and provide the ground troops that was going to actually be able to keep the rebels at bay. That turned out to be the Iranians. So the Russians and the Iranians formed an unholy alliance, including the use of Iran's irregular proxy forces to push back the rebel forces and extend influence. The one other group that Putin relied on in Syria was Russian mercenaries. Russian citizens who are not soldiers, who are paid for out of private companies. And about 6 months ago, some of these Russian mercenaries came within a couple of miles of a US position in Syria, and the US attacked them and killed somewhere between 200 and 300 Russians. That's more Russians killed by American live fire than at any time during the entire Cold War, and it barely made the newspapers. Because neither the United States nor Russia had any interest in having that get escalated for what could come as a result of it. So that's Russia's goal in Syria. Now, the challenge for the United States is that the Trump administration wants to, on the one hand, play fairly nice with Russia, and on the other hand, be very tough on Iran. So they want to split them in Syria and across the region. The problem is that, as I was describing before, Iran's the ground force to Russia's air force, so that just isn't plausible.
And Syria's provided another front for Iran. And then I guess today, which I'm not current on the news, there was some issue in France related to Iran. The issue with trading, the EU trading with Iran and the US not trading with Iran. Does the noose get tightened more around Iran's neck vis-a-vis trade, or everything stays hunky-dory with the EU?
So I was involved in negotiating the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what's known as the Iran nuclear deal. So I have an opinion about Donald Trump deciding to pull out of it. Now, what was interesting is over the couple of years that he was running for president, and then while he was in office, but before he pulled out of the deal, he would go around saying, this is the worst deal ever negotiated in human history. And my mom would call me and be like, is he right? And I would reassure her by saying that if, in fact, he is right, and it is the worst deal in human history, that itself is kind of an achievement. Because there have been a lot of deals in human history, and if this is the very worst one ever, then, come on. I mean, that's something. But that's the touchstone for to the question you're asking. Why is it that the United States is trying to tighten the economic noose around Iran? It's because they've pulled out of the deal and decided to go back to an economic pressure strategy with the goal of trying to get Iran to come out with its hands up and say, okay, we surrender. We're not just giving up all our nukes, but we're pulling out of every country in the Middle East, and we're going to essentially declare ourselves subservient to the United States in the region. Secretary of State Pompeo laid out 12 conditions Iran would have to meet for us to lift the sanctions. And they amount to not diplomacy, but just straight up surrender. So because Iran is unlikely to do that, the more likely outcome is the US will keep squeezing, and our secondary sanctions are very powerful. If we tell another country, if we tell the Europeans, you can't trade with the Iranians, and if you do, we're blocking access to the US market and the US financial system, that's a pretty easy choice for the Europeans. And so even though they want to stay in the deal, they're going to have to come into compliance. They will have to stop buying Iranian oil. And you're already starting to see that. Now, the problem is that at some point, if the US overuses this sanctions tool, if we go around to too many countries too many times telling them it's either them or us, then other countries are going to start figuring out workarounds. Not that the dollar won't continue to be the reserve currency, not that the US financial system won't remain critical, but countries will figure out point-to-point transaction systems so that they can avoid this threat of US sanctions. And the Chinese are already starting to do that with the Iranians.
So talking about trade and the Chinese moving that direction, east, west, directionally
East.
challenged.
Yeah. We could go east or west.
Right, right. So I think many of us here are free traders just by virtue of being investors in the market, and have been, worried about not the rhetoric, and if the rhetoric actually comes into actual legitimacy related to Chinese trade. So what's your perspective on that?
There are two possibilities here. Many of you guys will have seen that the Trump administration's just announced the new NAFTA, which is called the USMCA, because we can't call it NAFTA anymore. That's kind of the big thing. And what does the USMCA teach us about Donald Trump's overall take on trade? It's talk tough, push it to the brink, make aggressive maximalist demands, and then at the end of the day, basically agree something that he can claim as a victory, but is essentially a modest step forward from where we were before. So if you apply that logic to China, that at the end of the day, what he wants to be able to do is say, promises made, promises kept. I said I'd fix NAFTA, I fixed NAFTA. I said I'd get tough and get some stuff from the Chinese, I got it. You would anticipate that at some point in 2019, after he feels he's turned up the heat more, he'll cut a deal with the Chinese. And if you ask me, if you would ask me 6 months ago, I'd say that is the most likely, the most likely outcome. However, today I feel somewhat differently, because what's happening in the US-China relationship is, if you go back to Nixon's trip to China in '72, between '72 and 2016, you were talking about a pattern of increasing engagement at every level. Economic investment and trade, students going both ways, government officials meeting at every level, military to military engagement, and we are now in a period of disengagement, of decoupling. There are massive curbs on Chinese students studying in the US. Now any deal a Chinese company tries to do in the US is suspect and will be subject to enhanced scrutiny. Trade is obviously down. Our militaries are no longer talking. At the senior official level, there's much less communication than there was before. And this is happening at the same time that even Democrats, both on the Hill and in my world, in the foreign policy community, are basically saying, it's time to get tough on China. And so that, to me, suggests something bigger is afoot, that we could get to a point where we create a self-fulfilling prophecy of bad relations between the US and China, which make it much harder to come to that agreement on trade in 2019 that you might otherwise anticipate. So the question is, will those underlying forces that are very much at work right now and heading in a dark direction be more powerful, or will Trump's kind of desire for the tweetable win, where he can say, I got $100 billion off the trade deficit or whatever, be the thing that prevails in 2019? I don't think any of us have an answer to that, but that is the big question, really, that's facing all of us right now.
When we think about tweetable wins, it takes us kind of further connected to China into North Korea. And we've seen kind of the complete seesaw of where things could or might not go in North Korea. Do you have any predictions there?
I predict that North Korea will not give up its nuclear arsenal, and I feel pretty good in that prediction. I say that, however, at the same time that I say basically that's not the failure of Donald Trump's foreign policy. That's just sort of the laws of physics, the laws of diplomatic physics. You know, some of you guys will have seen that Trump went out the other day and basically said, maybe it was yesterday, and said, I've fallen in love with Kim Jong-un. I had to go back and look. I thought it was an Onion article at first, but no, he actually said that. He said he and I began exchanging letters, and we fell in love over the course of this. And I'm falling in love with you right now in this, this back and forth.
Don't look at my yearbook.
Yeah, right. If you're Kim Jong-un today, you feel great about the situation that you face. You have basically gotten rid of maximum pressure, because the South Koreans and the Chinese are now trading with you much more. You haven't had to give up a thing. You've got the South Korean president coming up and wanting to do normalization and a peace treaty. And you have the US president basically declaring you to be a great guy. So if you're Kim Jong-un, this is playing out exactly as you'd want. And so between now and 2021, and by the way, Mike Pompeo set the deadline for North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons as January 20th, 2021. It's kind of an interesting date for them giving up their nuclear weapons. But what it also means is for the Trump, so if you're Kim Jong-un, it's great. If you're Trump, it's great too. Because between now and January 20th, 2021, you can say, I've solved the problem. It's not an issue. There's no more Rocket Man and Fire and Fury. They're going to give them up. Don't worry. Maybe not this year, but next year. We're on a path. And by the way, it's not in the news to the same extent. None of us are as worried today as we were a year ago when Trump was ratcheting this up. So I predict, actually, that unless Kim does something really stupid, the North Korea issue will largely be in a box over the course of the next couple of years, with Trump declaring victory, Kim Jong-un kind of having his cake and eating it too, and nobody really wanting to disturb that status quo. Democrats not really wanting to go attack Trump for fear of, bringing back the brinksmanship we had before. So in a weird way, the North Korean nuclear issue will not be any 1 inch closer to being solved 2 years from today than it was 2 years ago. But somehow it will have been converted into a manageable threat.
So one of the topics that I think all of the countries we've talked about have engaged in, including our own, is the cyber world. And I think this is nonpartisan, bipartisan, et cetera. It's been very difficult to come up with, or at least in a publicly stated way, what a cyber escalation policy should be. I'm not expecting you in a technical sense to have one, but how do you think, what is an appropriate reaction to something, whether it's a Sony Pictures or a White House personnel file or a campaign or by a state actor, not a non-state actor?
Yeah. What's so interesting about this question is that if you work in the US government and that question is posed to you, how do you describe publicly, how do you set out a declaratory policy that says, if you hit us this way, we're going to hit you back that way? And the thing that every senior policymaker, whether they're Republican or Democrat, want to maintain is ambiguity, especially in the cyber domain.
Right.
You sort of want to say, at a time and place of our choosing, we'll respond, which at the end of the day has credibility, but only credibility if once we actually do respond in some way, which we have not really done.
Yeah.
So I'm torn between the impulse that says, got to maintain the ambiguity, got to keep all your options without really showing your hand, and the part of me that says, if we don't have some clear norms about what's inbounds and what's out of bounds, then this is going to keep escalating. Yeah. And this is going to be bad for the US in the following sense. For the last 230 years, the United States has been the least exposed, least vulnerable country in the world because we're protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Today, we are the most exposed, most vulnerable country in the world in cyberspace because of the integration of the US into the global economy and the fact that much of our private sector has not taken the steps to protect itself and the government hasn't helped them. So the US especially has every reason to want a set of norms. And I would start with one, which is essentially taking the principles of the Geneva Convention and applying them to cyberspace. And that is that civilian infrastructure, be it hospitals or electric grids or power grids or residential buildings or what have you, are off limits to attack. And if they are attacked, they'll be held to pay. Then you ask, okay, what's the hell to pay? And I think we have to work through that. But I think we should start by getting like-minded countries of the world to rally around at least that set of principles. And so far, we haven't been able to do that. But I think whether the Trump administration chooses to or not, whoever the next president is, a major focus of theirs should be to try to establish some of these norms.
So I was very close to being the National Security Advisor hat on. If you were, had our pad of paper here and we're ticking off the top 3 things you would say need to be addressed with a sense of urgency from the American perspective to put you on the spot, what would some of those that would round out the top 3 be?
Number 1 would be China. I think what's happened in the last 5 years is the pendulum has swung from a benign view that said China can be a responsible stakeholder, we can integrate them into the system we built and we can all get along, to this dark view that says we're going to be locked in a mortal competition with the Chinese and we don't trust them and we don't like them. And I think we need to find a more balanced point that is hard-headed but also flexible enough to be able to work with the Chinese on major challenges that we face. So for me, getting China right which means getting our larger Asia policy right is critical. And by the way, that's not just foreign policy. That's about making the investments in our strength at home, in technology and innovation and infrastructure and education that will allow us to compete effectively on positive playing fields with the Chinese and win the future. Second issue is climate change. Trump pulled out of and by the way, if you mention climate change in the national security context, there is a sense that somehow you've gone super soft, or why aren't you talking about the real stuff? But if you ask me what are the actual existential threats to the American people, like the things that could actually be so disruptive of our lives and livelihoods and way of life, climate change has got to be right near the top of the list, so we have to be mobilized to do something about it. And that is the kind of challenge that cannot be solved by the United States acting alone, but cannot be solved without the United States of America playing a central role.
From a functional perspective, to tie number one and number two together, does that tie into China and ultimately India?
Yeah. Because if we're not, at the same time that we're competing for advantage with the Chinese, we also have to be walking and chewing gum at the same time. We have to be figuring out how to work with them on a common understanding of what the curbs are going to be, what the mitigation measures are going to be. And that's what happened when the Paris Climate Agreement came in. That will be more difficult as we go forward, but we've got to do it. In a funny way, we have to do this with the Russians too on the third issue, I would say, which is the possibility that weapons of mass destruction fall into the hands of a terrorist or non-state actor and can be used against Americans. That is another type of threat that is at that existential level. Yeah. And that requires working closely with the Russians. So when we were doing the Iran negotiations, I had to meet with the deputy foreign minister of Russia, who was their lead negotiator in the Iran talks, to convince him to join us in a hard ask of the Iranians. And the Russians didn't want to do it, but he agreed in the end. He said, fine, we'll go along with you. Then I had to tell him as he was walking out the door, oh, by the way, we've just put a bunch of sanctions on you for Ukraine, but thank you for your help on the whole Iran thing. And that, for me, sort of crystallized the kind of complexity of American foreign policy today, which is that we have to be tough-minded in standing up to competitors like the Russians and Chinese, but we also have to be flexible enough to work with them where we have common interests. And those kinds of places, weapons of mass destruction, climate change, pandemic disease, the possibility of another global financial crisis, those are areas we're going to have to work with the other big economies in the world.
So with all this going on, and then in several weeks, we're going to have an election where potentially one of the houses of Congress switches parties. And if that happens, how does that pivot the world's view on how the strength of our foreign policy? Does it have as much teeth in the future? Do we look weaker in the world or internally?
I think the biggest thing that people are watching right now with the United States is Trump an aberration, or is he the new normal for American foreign policy? Is this kind of how it's going to be? Is this a storm, or is this climate change for the way that the United States operates in the world? And part of that is based on, is Trump going to get reelected? Which is the obsession of every leader that you talk to around the world. They want to know, is this a guy I've got to deal with for the next 2 years or the next 6 years? And if I got to deal with him for the next 6 years, that's a pretty good barometer that this is the overall direction America's going. So they look at the midterm elections as the metric for Trump, okay, am I going to have to deal with him or not? Which is not right, in my view. Obama got demolished in the 2010 midterm elections. Bill Clinton got demolished in the 1994 midterm elections. Both got reelected. I don't think it's right to do this, but this is how the world is looking at it. They will wake up on November 7th and say, if the Democrats have done very well, okay, this means maybe we can wait Trump out. And maybe we'll deal with him, but we'll assume he'll be gone in a little bit, which is not the right way for them to think about it. But I anticipate that that's probably the dominant mode of thinking right now.
So we're going to take some Q&A, and here are our parameters. Please ask succinct questions. Long statements will, be politely and in a humorous way interrupted. So who wants to shoot first? Mark.
I hear what you're saying about the rise of nationalism, populism amongst these countries. And at the same time, it seems like all the military movements are very calculated at this point. There's an accident today. I saw that there was a Chinese warship that came within feet.
45 yards.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, if you know, for those of you who know, even like small boats, okay, let alone warships, it's remarkable and unheard of in recent memory. Yeah.
These leaders aren't communicating like they used to, and obviously they have their own agendas to pursue. If an accident happens, will they show enough constraint to prevent these bad accidents from escalating into something else?
So there are three areas where that really worries me, and it's a great question. With respect to China, particularly in the South China Sea, but not exclusively. We also, we recently flew B-52 bombers quite ostentatiously across the South China Sea, and you could easily see a Chinese fighter getting in there real close, which they've done before. With Russia, where their hijinks with their fighter jets would make the people in Top Gun blush. I mean, they are getting so close that an accident could easily happen. And then, and we saw an accident in the Eastern Mediterranean where Syrian air defenses shot down a Russian transport plane because they were trying to shoot down Israeli missiles coming in. So the third area is the US and Iran potentially getting into, by accident, a conflict either in the Persian Gulf or somewhere else, and then having escalation. I think with the Russians, we have a very long-standing, well-developed, actually one of the kind of ironic positives out of the Cold War is the mechanisms for hotline communication, for conflict de-escalation, for figuring out how to manage through something like that, despite the problematic relationship, is probably the best. With the Chinese, to go along with this darker picture that I painted of how the strategic community is looking at it, we're not talking to them in a real way. We don't have those kinds of mechanisms. And the possibility that something goes bad and then worse is very real there. I think ultimately both sides have enough institutional checks to try to dial it back, but you can't go to sleep feeling great about that. And then in the Middle East, the real question for me is if something kind of accidental happens, are there actually forces on both sides, the John Boltons and the Soleimanis on the Iranian side, who want to take advantage of that to just get to the business of a war, which does worry me. I do think the possibility of a conflict between the US and Iran over the next 2 years in the Middle East is a real one, possibly sparked by something accidental, but then people say, okay, now it's time to get our game face on. So I think it's a great question that you've got these militaries operating in very close proximity in the fog of war, and in some places we do not have built-in mechanisms to be able to de-escalate as much as we would like to, and the unthinkable can quickly become thinkable if you start spinning out those scenarios.
Danny?
Slightly different stuff. The TPP. How do you feel about us walking away from TPP and its long-term, the goals of which, as I perceive it, is to contain China economically in some vein in that enormous range of countries that were involved. Long-term, how does that affect us, and how negative, or not negative, or not of any interest at all, is that to our foreign policy? Is that to our economic leadership in the world? Where are we?
Yeah. So what's interesting about TPP is that it's exactly as you described. It was an effort to deal with China's unfair practices, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, the relationship between the state and the market there that was sort of having them free ride off of the open international order by getting 40% of the world economy and all the major economies of the Asia Pacific to come together to say, these are the new rules. And ultimately, China's going to have to get with these rules. And the U.S. walking away from that, I think, has dramatically weakened our hand. Now we're dealing with the Chinese in a purely bilateral sense. And we have neither a common front with the Europeans, because we've also abandoned the US-EU agreement, nor a common front with our Asian partners to say to China, it's not just about US demands, this is about the world demanding it. The interesting thing is the other 11 countries in TPP went ahead anyway. And the point I was making before about countries not really sure if Trump is an aberration or the new normal, they negotiated among themselves a TPP that they tried to minimize the variances from the US agreement on the hope that on January 21st, 2021, a new US president just comes and plugs in. I think that's unlikely because the politics on the Democratic side on this issue are complicated, just as they are with the Trump Republican Party. But it goes to show you their mindset. They want the United States back in. They want us to be a part of this common effort. What I do think is likely to happen as we go forward is these two projects that began in the Bush administration and the Obama administration carried forward of a transatlantic and a trans-Pacific trade alliance are going to merge into one. That I think you're going to end up in a circumstance where basically 2/3 of the world's GDP is going to go to China. Trump will never do it because he only believes in point-to-point bilateral negotiation. But the next administration, whenever it comes, will try to basically create a new like-minded axis of countries that say there's new rules, and China, you better get with the program, or you're going to suffer against all of us, which is going to have a much greater impact on the Chinese than just the U.S. doing it on our own.
Would there have been any better prospect of TPP progressing domestically if the national security elements and defense elements were publicized more than pure the economics and trade and the heartland part?
I don't think so. In fact, Obama tried to sell it almost exclusively on that we've got to do this to write the rules instead of the Chinese writing the rules. Okay, and I don't think that works for people because I think they place trade deals in a particular box that is quite distinct from the strategic elements. They say, is this going to create jobs and raise wages or not? And the problem with TPP is, we're trying to sell it one way or the other, is in the near term, its benefits were probably oversold by its proponents and its downsides were oversold by its detractors on a pure economic basis. So you just couldn't, so for most people, you know, because there wasn't a really passionate constituency saying, we need this, God damn it, the result was that the voices of kind of skepticism on both left and right carried the day.
Right. Who else? Jay?
You gave a very sobering description of Russia in your opening remarks. And I'm trying to reconcile that with the democratic perspective of what happened during the 2018 election. And I just
16.
can't reconcile. If the administration were, really had that sobering of an opinion, wouldn't they have been more prepared? And just wondering if you could comment on that.
I think it was a failure of imagination, which is to say the idea of weaponizing hacks and leaks and then engaging in a kind of vertically integrated disinformation campaign inside the United States was something that neither the intelligence community nor the national security team around the president saw as a plausible outcome.
Russians have done that numerous times around Europe.
Yes.
I just have trouble reconciling, if you were that worried, why weren't you that prepared?
Well, two things. One, I wasn't in the administration at the time. I was on the Clinton campaign being hacked and yelling at the administration for not doing more. So I'm kind of with you. But the second thing is I really believe that this is a kind of version of American exceptionalism, not in the positive sense. That the mindset of, and this is not, leave the political folks aside, leave the president and the senior team in the White House aside. Just think about the U.S. intelligence community. Jim Clapper was on a podcast with Mike Morrell, both professional intelligence guys, not too long ago, where Morrell was pushing him. Morrell was out, Clapper was in as DNI, was pushing him. When did you guys realize the extent and nature of the Russian disinformation campaign, social media campaign in 2016? And Clapper basically said, not till very late. not till very late. That was the intel community. And I really think that this is because we were able to cabin our analysis, we being broadly the national security types, cabin our analysis of what the Russians were prepared to do, how far they were prepared to go, to a European project. But the idea that they would come over and do it in the United States, that seemed a bridge too far. And I will tell you that being on the campaign, when we sat down with the hosts and producers of all the major TV networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and CNN, which we did at the convention to sort of lay out our case that this was happening, they all looked at us like we had tinfoil hats. Like, you're crazy. How is this happening? And that kind of general view, I think, was more broadly felt across the journalist community, across the expert community, and within the government about it just like that's not going to cross the Atlantic. They're not going to do all that. So it was a rude awakening.
Well, apparently they've done it with the latest Star Wars movie too, so it just continues. No, I don't know if you've read that. That did happen. Other questions? Go ahead.
We've heard for years that resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is critical to peace in the Middle East. I was struck that you didn't bring that up as a hot point anymore. Is it just bypassed now through the Trump-Netanyahu relationship?
I think a couple things are going on. One, the relative importance of that conflict in terms of broader regional dynamics has diminished quite a bit since basically 2011, since the Arab revolutions and the increasing proxy war between the Gulf, Egypt, and Israel and Iran. And so you have this funny thing happening since 2011 where actually there's a convergence of interests between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Jordan on the one hand on two issues, on Iran and on political Islam. That means the existence of the conflict is no longer standing in the way of their quiet collaboration. So the relative importance of that issue as stopping other things from happening in the region has declined. Then the second issue is that people have basically concluded there is no deal. It's not going to happen with these two leaders. Maybe it can be preserved for the future, but with these two leaders, we are not going to see a peace deal. So now most people, when you raise it with them in the Middle East, if you try and raise, let's talk about peace, they sort of just roll their eyes and say, it's never going to happen. And what the Trump administration has done is essentially reinforce that to a certain extent by taking step after step that's essentially put the Palestinians further and further up a tree, say, we're not showing up anywhere, we're not doing anything. And I'll just say, having spent an enormous amount of time on this issue in government, the last time that Bibi Netanyahu and Abu Mazen, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, sat in the same room together was in 2010. And Hillary Clinton was the person who brought them together. And they had 3 sets of meetings in Washington, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and in the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. And I sat in these meetings and I watched these two men talking to one another. And one of the arguments for having diplomacy and putting leaders together is to break down mistrust and build some confidence. And I'll tell you, this had the exact opposite effect. These two guys were in the same room together. They both walked out like, I cannot do business with that guy, in a really kind of aggressive way. And so I became convinced, even before the Arab Spring, back in 2010, that the conditions were not right for this. And then when I was working for the Vice President Biden, we went and saw Abbas. And Biden said to him, let me ask you a question. If you got everything you wanted, you got the deal you walked in with on day one of negotiations with the Israelis and put down, the Israelis just said, fine, we'll take it. Could you sell it to your people? And Abbas sort of sat there and he pulled on his coat and he crossed his legs and he said, I think so. I think so. And Biden walked out and was like, this is never happening. I mean, if like on that extreme hypothetical, it can't be sold, it can't be sold. And there's a lot of other dynamics at play, but it's difficult and depressing because this is an issue that the United States should continue to invest in mightily and do everything it can to produce a sustainable, just, lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. But it's gotten very difficult. And even the Trump administration has, for the moment, shelved its plan to move forward on this.
One last question. Go ahead, right here.
Elaborate a little more on Brexit and what you think of the possibilities there?
So it's funny, as we're sitting here consumed with the insanity in Washington, D.C., the Brits are competing with us aggressively for insanity on their side of the pond. This battle between Boris Johnson, the deposed foreign minister and potential future prime minister, who knows, and Theresa May, I still believe that May is going to steer this to what I sort of call a blind Brexit, which is a high-level agreement this year with the details to be filled in through negotiations over the next 2 years, and a little bit deferring the Irish question, which has become really critical, this fundamental issue of how to deal with the problem of the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And I think they will basically come up with some form of words that keeps the Northern Irish party that is in the government on side, but without giving a lot of specificity. Talk about some of the larger potential elements of a deal, but all of them will be quite vague, and then they'll spend the next 2 years negotiating. I still bet that that is what is going to happen, and that Johnson's full-scale assault on that in the hopes of getting a hard Brexit this year will ultimately not succeed. That being said, I mean, any of you betting, will Kavanaugh get confirmed? Won't he? You know, what's going to happen in November with the House, with the Senate? It's equally hard to predict on this. It is possible this whole thing falls apart and there is a hard Brexit at the end of this year. And the European scope for being able to negotiate this flexibly is constrained by what we were talking about earlier, which is if they give too good a deal to Britain, then Italy will become calling next and saying, well, give us that same deal, and then so on and so on. So I think there's enough incentive on both sides to do what effectively is a kick the can down the road, an acceptance that there will be a Brexit on some negotiated terms, with those terms to be negotiated in a transition period in 2019 and 2020. But boy, the way that things are going inside the Conservative Party just over the last 72 hours makes it very hard to say that with any great degree of confidence.
To indulge, because I'm sitting up here, I'll take the last question. So there's this vote that may or may not happen in Washington. There's an election in a few weeks. What do you think about 2020? You know all the people we all only read about. What's your guess?
Oh, boy.
We can edit this out of the recording, too.
No. Look, I think it is. I will do what's probably rare in these waterside chats, and probably not like very satisfying, and just say I have no idea. Like I literally have no idea.
All right.
Because you have a situation where you could have between 15 and 20 candidates potentially declaring, many of whom have very low name recognition, a few of whom have 100% name recognition or near. You have questions around a generational gap. You have questions around how dominant the electability issue will be, to the extent to which people just want someone who's going to be able to beat Trump versus someone who, like in 2016, fulfills their passions. You have the question of whether both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren run, which will have a big impact on the left. You have the question about whether Joe Biden will choose to get into the race or not, and he will loom very large as a factor. You have certain results in 2018 that will, have some impact potentially as well on what the shape of the field looks like. So I think it is just really too soon to tell. But I will make one prediction, which maybe is a little bit unusual, and that is, if you look at the Democratic Party base right now, it is a fired up base, and it is a somewhat angry base, or angry about what's happening right now. So you might think there's going to be a kind of out anger dynamic to the Democratic presidential primary. I predict to you that it will go in the opposite direction. That in fact, the candidates are going to race to prove that they are uniters, that they can pull people together, and that they can be the antidote to what we've seen over the last couple of years. And so, counterintuitively, as much as this energy is carrying many of these folks along right now and is shaping their decisions about how they play on certain issues today, when people don the cloak of candidate, I think mostly this is going to be a civilized conversation. And the second thing I will predict, and I'll come back here and you can throw tomatoes at me if I'm wrong. The second thing I'll predict is that, unlike in 2016, where Bernie Sanders just viciously attacked Hillary Clinton's character and, daily, all the way right up until the convention, I think there will be a huge price to pay for Democrat-on-Democrat violence next year. Because everyone's going to say, hold on a sec, we're not going through that again. We have bigger fish to fry, et cetera. And so actually, it's going to really mute the degree to which you're going to have huge contestation around character or around kind of negative campaigning. But what do I know? So,
well, we'll bring you back to find out. Thank you very much, Jake.